Doc Slab Audio on music production and audio engineering. Welcome to Doc Slab and our 6th Master Series. I do believe this is the 3rd video in our 6th Master Series, Session Templates. And in this video, we want to talk about creating a creation template. And I'm going to try to give a little bit of an introduction here because the reason for this, first of all, if you're just a recording engineer, it's really going to help you refine yourself as a recording engineer, because a lot of times in the industry that's what you do. So you will really refine the work that you do so that by the time you've got a file that's done, that's ready for a really good mixing engineer to work with, that he's going to do light editing, light processing, and mix. So you're going to drag those files and put them into a folder, a transfer folder that you're going to take in your engineering session. So you're really going to hone your skills. It's going to really get your mindset there more to where those are finished files from the recording session and you're a recording engineer. And you've really, those files are beautiful, bro. I mean, the engineer's not going to have to sit there and mess with things all day, which means that will probably be you, right? So, and on the side of producers and artists, that having a creation template is going to really help you refine yourself in that area, because it's a separate area that you don't see it as this other thing that's so complicated, that you're really just focusing on creating, composing, refining it and refining it and refining it, and then really honing your performance so that your performance is as good as possible. And with that being said, that as far as performance is concerned, it's the same thing with working with VSTs. VSTs, you can do all kinds of things with MIDI, and editing MIDI information, there is mountains of tools to edit MIDI information. And once you render things down or bounce things down, you can do more work on it before you give it to the mix engineer if you want, or make notes about it that you're going to do a little bit more work on it when it gets to the mixing session. Does that make sense? But normally that's for light processing. Those files should be great. They shouldn't need a lot of work done on them once they get there. So you'll really refine yourself there. Does that make sense? And it's huge, because once you really start working on that things like your amplifier settings, your instrument settings, your mic settings, everything becomes way more important, because it's all in this area. It's not part of the other part of it. And your brain will slowly start to see that, and you will most assuredly improve in those areas. And by the time you get done, those are finished files that you're sending to a professional mixing engineer that's going to do light editing, light processing, and mix, and get a mix down, send to the mastering engineer. You will find that your workflow, your attitude, and your tempo will improve 100%, I almost guarantee you. So with that being said, that it's pretty simple, you know, getting a creation template set up and then opening it up, renaming it, whatever your song, creation phase of some song, and then get going. Normally on the timeline, I have it set up to seconds and bars so I can see what's going on as I'm working on things. And I've got markers or these kind of things that are set up sections in transitions and movements, and I just move these around as I'm working through a production. Does that make sense? And as you get done with things, you're going to save this whole thing for later. So you can take like MIDI files and you can either record them to another track, do a mix down of them, or you can bounce them, render them to audio, save the file, and then undo that so it's got a pristine session with all the MIDI information, everything as it was as you were creating it. Does that make sense? And we'll kind of go through that a little bit. So basically, on my creation template, this is one I'm working on, but a really good layout, a good start on a layout to just get you going. That, you know, because that's what I'm working on my new one. I've got a burr up my butt, and, you know, as far as getting a new one going. So, you know, it's like, you know, basically on my main buses, it's really simple. It's not like a mixing session. I've got an RX-7 monitor, a limiter bus to catch any transients, you know, or anything hitting the roof. And then I've got a meeting bus that I can meter the audio and analyze the audio really well. And that's basically it on my out buses. I've got a lot of group buses, and I've got a lot of FX chains. So, you know, and I will talk about this in a minute, that it starts out, it's pretty simple. I've got like an area where I've got anything external. There's my external amp, clean guitar. I've got amps for my clean guitar setup. I've got, or acoustic guitar, I should say, and then clean guitar, and then I've got my acoustic guitar or clean guitar with amplifiers, distorted guitar. I've got like 3 amplifiers here. I've got some other amp sims that I'm working on, or things that's going on that I'm just going to add to. Bass, clean bass with body and effects and things like that. That's just standard, you know. One place for vocals and harmonies. Next, another place for any other external instruments, pianos or sax or whatever I might be working on that might come up. You know, then I come down to my MIDI instruments. This is huge because the better you get at editing that MIDI, I mean, you hardly ever need an actual instrument. And I've got like 400 instances of MIDI instruments in this session. Everything's ready to go. Any instrument, any type of thing I need, it's just open and start plucking away. Does that make sense? And just start rolling, you know, and composing. You know, there's font synths, there's normal synths, there's percussion, you know, synths, musical percussion, and other types of percussion. And there's other things your DAW will do. I have a multi-instrument that let me combine a bunch of VSTs and effects that let me do arpeggios and repeating and all kinds of stuff that are separate things that I keep kind of separate when I'm going to utilize them. And then I come down, I mean, there's tons of them, and they all have their different sections, choir, strings, brass, you know, whatever, all the way down. And it's really refined to where there's a lot of them. Does that make sense? And I mean, I've got lots of choices. There's like 400 instances to have just ready to roll. I mean, no matter what I want. Samples and loops, there's a section for samples and loops. And then I come down, record the tracks. So I can go down to those buses, and I can either record those tracks, or if it's like 3 amplifiers or 2 amplifiers, or it's MIDI information, then I can just route it into here and get a capture of it, like recording it. Does that make sense? And it's done. I check it, it's final, and it's, you know, it's good to go. Does that, or I can do a mix down. I can also do a mix down also. And then, you know, mute everything else, and then just do a real quick mix down to another track and drag it up into this area. This is my audio files area, and I'll rename this vocals, guitar, bass, whatever as I'm going, and start laying these things out one section at a time, like it's an engineering section for mixing, but just getting the, you know, everything as far as the composition, the performances, the tracks done, and arrangements done to where it's just ready to roll. And then I take it into the engineering session for the final editing, little light edits, light processing, mixing, and a mix down. And mix down tracks also. And it's not that complicated. And when we come up here, we look at, like, let's say that, you know, buses. Off all these, you got buses coming off here, so that I can record off those buses or do mix down off those buses. And there's not really nothing on there that's hitting a limiter to make sure it doesn't hit anything hard, or, you know, anything bouncing out of the, you know, to clipping or anything like that. And maybe a compressor before that limiter. But and that's it. Those buses are set up, ready to go for all of them. You can set up as many buses as you want. And FX chains, you know, I've got a pedal board, you know, delay, chorus, reverb, you know, other effects in the DAW, saturation, and noise that are all set up as FX chains. You can put as many of them as you want on there. So no matter what you work on, you've got a ready to go FX chain. You can just name for those and rock and roll. Pedal boards, delays, choruses, or delays and echo effect, choruses, you know, these are huge. You know, different types of reverb, convolution, normal reverb, you know, any other type of effect you might have in the DAW, you know, even harmonics, odd harmonics, full spectrum saturation, you know, hard saturation, and then noise. You know, I got a tone generator with the EQ that I'm shaping the noise to sound more like brown noise or blue noise or violet noise, and then a gate on after it, you know, to open and close whenever there's only just sound. Does that make sense? I got Sonar Works on the output for room issues, and I also put it on the input just to deal with any room issues that I have that we already talked about in the last master series. But everything's just good to go, ready to rock and roll. And it's not that complicated. I mean, the whole setup's pretty simple. You know, trying to keep it as simple as possible and geared to creation. There's an area here that's for MIDI information because I play my guitar into this stuff here, and I can play any VST instrument I have with my MIDI guitar. Does that make sense? Do anything that I can do with the keyboard with my guitar on any instrument. So sometimes I like working that way, but it's not that complicated. It's set up pretty easily, you know, and you will eventually refine this until you just get it to where it's really working for you. The more you start working through productions and the more time you spend working through productions, that the more refined this will get. And by the time you get done, that you really have a place to create in. You've got a place to, you know, to do arrangements. You got a place to practice your, you know, your performances and hone those and practice fine-tuning your MIDI information and getting great files, you know, really mastering, becoming a recording engineer to where it's just done. It's like handing these files are going to a mixing engineer, bro. They better be right. Does that make sense? And by the time you get done, you will find the more time you spend like that, that when you drag them into your mixing session, you'll be like, oh, these files are great, bro. I mean, they're great. Man, the producer who was on this job did a good job, and the recording engineer spent his time on there, and yeah, these files are so nice to work with. A little bit of light editing, maybe a little bit of light processing, and get to mixing and do a mix down, bam, off to the mastering engineer. You will find that you will be a much happier producer and engineer working like that. So I don't want to get it too complicated. I've got a track up here for notes, a tone generator, and some reference tracks, but you know, it's pretty simple. The layout's pretty simple, and it's not that complicated, you know, when you start looking at it. You know, I mean, there's a lot of buses, FX chains and things like that, a lot of group buses, and there's a lot of stuff going on here, but it's not really that complicated. There's a lot of VSTs for working and a lot of things set up. And it's the more it grows, you'll find it can get pretty complex, you know, and depending on how you work, and the more complicated stuff you work on, it can get pretty complicated, but it's a separate area for you to do that. So you have to basically look at it as you're a producer and recording engineer, and that's your space. Does that make sense? When it's done there and you got those files done, you've named them and they're done, and you drag them in a transfer folder, you know, I mean, you've got them set up to where it's like, got one here that, you know, one of the things you really want to keep in mind is that you want to basically have, you know, things like going from 0 out to wherever it is. Does that make sense? That way you can drag everything right up to 0 on the tracks and not have problems there. You know, does that make sense? And everything will line up just fine. Does that make sense? So, I mean, it's a pretty simple concept and just something you're going to want to work on because it's huge in my humble opinion. And having that a separate area for you to work in is great because the more time you spend refining this, the smoother your production area is going to go and your recording area, and the better tempo you'll keep going, the more you'll get done. And when you get done, you're going to really make sure those files are right before you take them to a transfer tile. It's like you were taking them to send them to an actual mix engineer, that they better be as right as possible, bro. Does that make sense? So it'll really help refine you there. So that's the first template we want to look at, and that's a basic layout so that you can just get kind of started and rolling along with that and start refining it. Does that make sense? So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this next video on session templates, and I'll see you in the next video.